Hey there everybody, Mr. Lewis here. I hope you're doing well. We're ready to move forward with Unit 6 in AP HuG today as we continue to explore political geography. And to do that, we're going to go through some official notes today, specifically Section 6.1 and 6.2. Section 6.1 is a continuation of our introduction to political geography, and it really gives us an idea of what the geopolitical landscape looks like around the world in terms of what sort of nations we find, what types of states we find, and what the difference is between those two things. And then we'll also get into the types of borders and boundaries that we find around the world. Some of these borders and boundaries are set naturally, things like rivers, mountain ranges, what have you, but some of them are actually man-made, and they've been shaped and shifted and changed over the years, and we want to see why. And that leads us into Section 6.2. Political processes, and this really discusses and focuses a little bit more in depth on how these boundaries and why these borders do change over time. And then today, what types of boundaries we find all around the world. So without further ado, let's dive into Section 6.1. All right, 6.1, Introduction to Political Geography. And in political geography, first and foremost, we have to differentiate between a nation and a state. A nation is a body of people who are relatively homogeneous in their culture, in their beliefs, in their behaviors. A united nation of people. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are an official country. That's what a state is. A state is an organized nation with a government, laws, an economy, and a stable population. So a nation state, if we put both of those together, a nation state is a country in which there is a relatively homogeneous population, language, heritage, culture, things like that. A nation state is not the category we would place the United States of America into. The United States of America is a multi-ethnic state. We have multiple different ethnic groups, racial groups, people with very different heritage, people who use different languages, practice very different religions. We are a melting pot, whereas a nation state is relatively homogeneous across the board. Now, there are different types of nations, different types of states, and you can see a few of those listed here. A stateless nation, for example, is a homogeneous nation of people who have no official sovereign state to call their own. This would be like the Kurds, right? We talk about Kurdistan as the region where we find the Kurds, but Kurdistan is not an official state. It is really describing the area in which we find the stateless nation of people known as the Kurds. They have no official sovereign state to call their own and run in their own way. Then we have what we call a multi-state nation. Well, this is when you have a nation of people like the Kurds who are spread across multiple states. And that is what we find with the Kurds, a homogeneous nation of people divided among multiple countries, multiple states. This is also true with Koreans between North Korea and South Korea. This is also true with the Irish between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So we see different types of nations, different types of states. A multinational state would be a state with multiple nations of people residing in it. This would be like the USA. Then you get what we call regions, right? A region is a territory of some type within a country that either does enjoy freedom or does not enjoy freedom, has complete freedom or autonomy over their affairs, or limited freedom, or what we would call semi-autonomous. So Greenland, for example, we talked about this toward the beginning of this unit, is an autonomous region belonging to the state of Denmark, the country of Denmark. Now, there are also many different types of states in terms of their shape. There's what we call a landlocked state, where they have no direct outlet to the sea. This would be like Mongolia, for example. A city-state, where the country itself is actually a sovereign state consisting of really just the city and maybe some surrounding land, but mostly the city itself. This could be like Vatican City, for example. A compact state is one where the distance from the center of the country to the border, the boundary, is roughly the same all the way around the country. So if you were thinking of a circle as a state, as a country, that's exactly what this would be. If you have a perfect circle, the distance from the center of that circle to the boundary in any direction is going to be the same. That's kind of like what a compact state is. Then you have an elongated state. This is kind of like Italy, for example, a state with a long, narrow shape. And Italy is even more unique because they are jutting out, so to speak, sticking out into a body of water. In the case of Italy, it's the Mediterranean Sea. We have microstates that are encompassing very, very small areas of land. Again, Vatican City would be another example there. A perforated state is a state that completely envelops or surrounds another state. Italy would be an example of that because Vatican City, which I mentioned as a microstate, Vatican City is actually completely surrounded by the country of Italy. It is enveloped by Italy, and that makes Italy a perforated state. A prorupted state is one that's basically compact, but then has a unique, large projecting extension that's kind of jutting out from the rest of the country. It's mostly compact, and then it has like this arm sort of thing sticking out from the north or the east or the south or the west. From one side of the country, we see this large projecting extension of land. Thailand would be a good example of this. It's mostly compact, but then there's this large stretch of land that sticks out from the rest of Thailand. And finally, a fragmented state. A fragmented state is a state with two or more territories that are disconnected. The United States of America would be a fragmented state because we have the 48 contiguous states, of which Indiana is a part, but we also have Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, all these states and territories that are U.S. land but are disconnected from the majority of the country. So any type of nation, or I should say state, any type of country that has multiple pieces that are disconnected would be a fragmented state. This is also true of island nations that have multiple islands. For example, Indonesia. Indonesia consists of thousands of islands. It's what we call an archipelago, a country consisting of many islands. Well, that would also be a fragmented state. So the question becomes, how are states formed? How are they dissolved? Why do they change over time? Why do some states or regions have more autonomy than others? How do states become independent? How do they gain their sovereignty or lose it? That's what section 6.2 really gets us into, and this is titled Political Processes. So, one of the major causes of changes to our world in terms of the borders and boundaries that we live in and the borders and boundaries that determine our laws around the globe is conflict. Conflict can create borders, it can change borders, it can unite people, it can divide people, it can change laws, it can change leaders, it can change everything. And it's not just war. Conflict can mean a lot of different things, right? We've seen conflict play out in war quite a bit. In the case of World War I, imperialism and militarism and nationalism led to the creation of these very large, multinational, multi-state, supranationalist organizations like the League of Nations, the Yugoslavia, eventually Soviet Russia as well, right? In the middle of World War I, there's a civil war in Russia, and eventually Russia turns into the Soviet Union, the USSR, and so that takes us into World War II. We get more expansionism, pushing the political boundaries, fascism, ethno-nationalism, different sorts of states and nations rising up and pushing for their sovereignty or the sovereignty of others, trying to claim greater territory. And we have empires expanding their reaches. So the effects of World War II, we get the creation of Israel after World War II. We get the United Nations. There's decolonization. So in some ways, we have the organization and the creation of these supranationalist sort of organizations, but also we get decolonization, where these big colonial powers that we've been discussing all year, like the British and the French and the German and the Portuguese empires, the Spanish Empire, they begin to move out of some of these areas that have been colonized. Decolonization takes place over the course of the 50s and 60s and 70s, and many of these countries who were once colonized gain back their sovereignty, and with this, borders are constantly shifting and changing and altering. This leads us into the Cold War. So there were these political differences that were formed both before and after World War II, but after World War II, the world is very much taking sides, forming teams, right? And these teams, again, reference supranationalism. These organizations such as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, where we find multiple countries coming together for one common cause, whether it's military defense or economic benefits, like in the case of the European Union, or the United Nations, to keep world order, so to speak. We see these different supranational organizations developing throughout the 1900s, World War I, World War II, and the Cold War itself. And many of these organizations are still around today. Now, today, conflict hasn't just gone away. We have many different types of conflicts around the world. Political conflict, such as the ones that are taking place in Venezuela and Egypt. You're going to read more about the political instability in Venezuela in your global conflicts activity, which is coming up soon. There's territorial conflict, such as the ones that we've discussed in the Ukraine, between Russia and the Ukraine, or in Israel, between the state of Israel and the state of Palestine. There are sectarian conflicts. There are civil wars waging around the world. There are criminal conflicts around the world. Interstate conflicts, right? The United States is involved in one right now between America and Iran. So there are different types of conflicts, some of which will impact borders over time, some of which will not. But many of them, such as the one involving North and South Korea, are based entirely on political differences. And these political differences don't just impact borders and boundaries, they impact our day-to-day lives. One final type of conflict that we hear a lot about in the United States is terrorism. And transnational terrorism is not just something that the United States is dealing with. We're seeing it occur, unfortunately, in many regions of the world. Pakistan, Somalia, and Mali are a few examples that come up, and a few examples that you will see in your activity when you go to do that tomorrow. So I'm not going to talk too much about those right now. You'll see a couple of those examples in your activity. Now, this activity itself, there's a website that's going to take you, a link to a website that's going to show you a map of the world and all these different conflicts that you can click on and learn a little bit more about. In this activity, I'm asking you to click on specifically 5 of those conflicts. You can float around on the website and read up as much as possible. I totally encourage that, but there are 5 that I am specifically asking you to dive a little bit deeper into and answer some questions about. So please make sure you go in and do that, find out a little bit more about some of the conflicts that are shaping our world, answer the questions that go with those, and then next time we talk, we'll move into section 6.3. All right, everyone, that's it for today for section 6.1 and 6.2. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you next time.